I was asked to give a few comments on the papers. I will keep it short, so we will have some time for questions. All right, I never met George Mosse, I have to confess. When I started my undergrad studies at the Hebrew University, he was not teaching anymore. However, as a student at the Hebrew University and later as an exchange student in Madison, Wisconsin, I often witness my teachers having this George Mosse moment, saying, George used to say this, or, you know, for this question, George always answered, and they would have this foggy look in their eyes. And usually it comes with a smile, because those memories had to do with some sort of witticism, some saying that is only fully understood on a second thought. So I never personally witnessed this playfulness of George Mosse, but I did have acquaintance myself with his writings, of course, which were the point of departure from many classes I took as a student, still in my research and in the classes I teach today. The three talks we heard testified to the ways Mosse's writing are still relevant and important today. And they did it by focusing on topics that Mosse was not keen to emphasize or was reluctant to explore. David Sorkin noted that Mosse was less concerned with the details of emancipation. He was interested in its outcome, which was for him the integration of Jews within the German middle class, mainly through the adoption of Bildung as a fundamental ethos. Sorkin, however, reminds us that emancipation was not a linear process. It was maybe not a process at all. It was different in different places, in different time. Even in Germany, it was different in different places, had different rules, locals and nationals. It involves different types of rights and how to acquire them, and many times it was also lost. The questions that I think we need to ask ourselves, and maybe, David, you can say some things about it, is what would be the implication of your narrative for the understanding of, or let's say that's what, how would it, had Mosse took this into account, how would it change his narrative? Would it go more towards what some of his students called German Jews beyond Bildung, or would it be back to Bildung in some way? And how would we think of what happens after 1933 if we think about it as not the first time where Jews losing their emancipation? I mean, this can be a part of a longer history. In her intriguing paper, Darcy Buerkle argued that the ways Mosse referred to the Weimar era, the way he imagined Weimar, was in a speculative tone, as a could-be process, which one cannot know where it would have led. This depiction corresponds with his own biography as a young homosexual who had to conceal his identity. It can be argued that irony is central to the speculative tone. While the adherence to the principle of Bildung facilitated Jewish integration in Mosse's mind and enabled the prominence of the Mosse family itself before 1933, respectability, a pillar of Bildung, was responsible for his and his mother's need to conceal their identity. As Darcy shows, the gaps between the original manuscript and the published version of Mosse's memoirs highlight his tendency to reflect on his childhood and of Weimar with the same terms as missed opportunities. Since we are speaking about speculative mode of thinking, I would like you, Darcy, maybe to speculate as well. Do you think that Mosse would have written a different history had he ended after immigration in a place that was more tolerant to homosexuals? In other words, was it American Puritanism or Midwestern Puritanism that shaped his historical writings? Would he have written a different Weimar history had he written it in Hebrew? Language is a major theme also in Marc's paper. The Kongressdeutsch of the Zionists, he argues, was an arena where the meaning of German, its tensions between universality and particularism, helped negotiating different perception of what Zionism is. Once again, it shows how important was German culture and Bildung to the Jewish national movement, but also how the movement tried to define itself against German as a language, a culture, and a particular type of emancipation. Kongressdeutsch, in fact, enables Zionists to conceive their essence as not German and not Yiddish and not Hebrew, as a unique space that takes aspects from German universalism, cultural, intellectual tradition, so forth, and from Yiddish sense of Jewish particularism, perhaps imagined Jewish common ground. They could wrestle something new out of these different languages and different heritage of Jewish life. Marc, you noted that this phenomenon changes after 1933, when German is growingly identified with National Socialism. One can assume, however, that some Central European Jews still tried to defend the use of German, or even of Kongressdeutsch after 1933, especially when now we have so many new Zionists in Germany. Or maybe you can say a few words about the dynamics of what is going there, and maybe the opposition to the development that you describe. Now, finally, when I read these papers, one image popped into my mind. It's from an album of a Jewish family going on vacation on the Alps in 1937. But to go on a vacation on the Alps is to be part of German bourgeois culture. And this image of doing it in 1937 in the Tracht, that it's another kind of symbol of belonging to this middle-class culture, seems to me like a display of the endeavor to cling to this emancipation in times where this emancipation is lost or is being lost. And do it all standing on the head, maybe adds, for us at least, from today, a sense of irony. But the irony was there to begin with. That was the page. And you can see that it was attached to a note on this Father William who stands on his head, taken from Alice in Wonderland. In English, mind you. The other album is in German, of course, all the captions are in German. But this is in English. Perhaps to tell us that if you look from outside German, or maybe only when you look from outside German, as a language, a culture, a symbol, you can see this attempt to cling to this tradition as absurd or maybe even a fantasy, a delusion, but not necessarily from inside. So I thought it would be a nice image to have in the background of our discussion because it ties together the topics we discussed here, and also maybe relate to George Mosse himself, who wrote in English the history of this phenomena. And when he was writing it, he was not standing on his head, but maintaining a sense of playfulness and irony. On this note, maybe we will hear maybe we'll take some questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you. My question is to Darcy Buerkle. I'm so delighted that you tackled the queerness of George Mosse head on, and to me this is like the first time when it was really addressed fully, as I wish, for this conference, and when queer history kind of comes from the margins to the center, which is something what makes George Mosse so special. But the last years really in queer theory and queer history pushed for against tolerance and for integration. We don't need to be tolerated, we need to be in the thick of it. Rather than that Mosse was interesting because he was gay and closeted, it says something about bigger history. It's not only that we should mention that also he was gay, it's something that makes his work special, but also maybe tells us the history of modern European culture and so on differently. And maybe you could spell it out a little bit more.
Is this on? So I agree with your comment. I mean, your comment is that this is not an addition. It's absolutely central to the way that we think about European history, right? And that to think about George Mosse is not to think about George Mosse the man, and he was gay, and he was, and I agree with that. That's what I was trying to do, is show the centrality, but also show that the centrality means that we have to tolerate not being able to, we have to tolerate making something central for which we do not have all the evidence, right? So that's what I was trying to show. So yeah, thank you.
There are many hands. So where is the microphone?
The microphone's back here.
Okay.
I need it. Yeah, so these were great. You know, one thing that struck me all day, and it really struck me already yesterday, was the degree to which will all continue to reinforce what we knew when we came, which was the degree to which Mosse anticipated so many of the turns that history would take, not only cultural history, but for many of us in the field, how significant his work would be. And it's curious because of the generation, you know, of emigre historians that came and that were self-conscious of themselves as such a generation, it would have been hard for them to recognize and to anticipate, if you think, you know, also very famous people, Fritz Stern, Peter Gay, Fritz Ringer, the rest of them, that it's really, none of those works anticipated things that history had not even thought of approaching the way that George's work did. And that's, you know, it's kind of curious puzzle, that enduring importance of those directions he took. So the question I had was, you know, this particular panel reminded me that one of those kinds of things that he anticipated was the turn to subjectivity, even though it wasn't a term that he would have used in the way that it's used now. He wrote in the age of historians writing about identity, but it seems like, well, of course, Darcy's paper in particular very poignantly points to the ways in which the historian's subjectivity and subjectivity as a historical category is thematized in the work, even as he sometimes shied, as one would in those generations, from putting one's own subjective relation to the work front and center. He pointed to it in so many ways that have been pointed to today. And in the papers we just heard, I mean, to David's paper too, I was thinking in terms of the way you were talking about emancipation in light of Mosse's work, that, and I've commented on this before, that in the wonderful work that you did, you know, a long time ago, and that now is very relevant to the book on emancipation, where you argued, in fact, as you somewhat argued now, that emancipation and the Jewish subculture that was the subject of emancipation in the 18th century, that was invisible to itself, that brilliant argument you made. You said that it was a structural rather than a subjective phenomenon, right? And here, in your definition of this shifting field of emancipation, you marked the field with these particular moments of getting it, losing it here, in this spot, and that spot, which kind of belies that history of subjectivity that would argue that the ebb and flow of emancipated citizenship takes a course that is not strictly and entirely determined by those external structural phenomena. And I could say more also about Zionism, but I feel like it's for all three of you. The question is subjectivity.
Well, Scott, thank you for that Scott, thank you for that very incisive question. I think you're pointing at precisely what I had in mind in revisiting George's work and now my own current work on emancipation, which is I think what we still don't have, and it's still a major desideratum, would be to understand how German Jews in various periods responded and first understood and then responded to the actual fluctuations in emancipation, that ebb and flow, as you put it. How did German Jews understand what happened in 1815 when they lost the rights that they had had during the French occupation, or in the states that were allied with France, like Baden and Bavaria, or in Prussia, which was certainly competing with France? What was the actual impact in terms of their understanding of their relationship to the people among whom they were living in the various German states, their relationship to German culture, their access to institutions, their career opportunities? It's that kind of fine-grained history that still hasn't been written. George brilliantly laid out the sort of large patterns, but a more detailed, nuanced, granular history is something that we just don't have. The connection, the link between the structures of emancipation and the details of emancipation and the subjective developments, it's a history that hasn't been written.
So my question is for Darcy as well. In addition to the intellectual rigor, I found your paper extremely moving. I wanted to say that. The pain of lifting out of silence and imposed silences, and in keeping with the speculative, the weight of the speculative, I'm wondering if Mosse already foreshadowed a renewed silencing in academia that I feel we are experiencing sometimes today. Not on the issue of homosexuality, maybe, but on other issues. That we are continuing of refusing to acknowledge authenticity or the silencing of questions that would otherwise be very relevant.
Well, first of all, yes, thank you for this really extraordinary set of papers. I have just two questions, which are, one is more directly for David and one is more directly for Darcy, but in some way they're for both of them. David, I was struck by your statement that full emancipation in some way arrived with Weimar, and by its sort of, in some ways, not contradiction, but sort of contrast to the story to the stories we heard yesterday about the sort of meteoric rise of German Jewry in the Kaiserreich, and the ways in which the post-World War I period, I mean, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, I'm sort of just curious about how you would think about this. how in some ways, of course, the First World War already, and with the Judencensus and then Weimar, marked a kind of decline in that sense of rise and security, even as it did guarantee full civil rights in a way that it hadn't before. And so I'm just sort of curious about the sort of squaring of, or sort of juxtaposing a kind of political history with economic history, and also sort of where then cultural history fits into your periodization and chronology. And then Darcy, Darcy. And I guess in some ways this is also about the question of, where Zionism would have gone. But I actually wanted to ask you about something that I think was in the original, in one draft of your paper. This speaks to the importance of what you did in terms of going back to the archives and reading drafts. And I may have I can't completely distinguish the two anymore, what you said and what you wrote. But along the lines of speculation about the possibilities that were open and those that were foreclosed, one can't help but wonder, and I'm taking this from you, what would have happened if George Mosse had in fact lived in Weimar, Berlin, if he had not been isolated by virtue of his age and, of course, by the sort of isolated splendor. And, I mean, you yourself have noted kind of the irony, right, of being, of having been born into a place where homosexuality was openly practiced, where there was a gay culture, and not even necessarily just a subculture, but actually a gay culture, and what that might have meant. And I think that might tell us something also about these moments of what might have been, because that is, I think, also a memory that many emigres carried with them. I mean, I could, tell anecdotes from my own family about sort of the shock of transferring from a kind of Weimar Berlin to a very repressive, sexually repressive, not to mention McCarthyism, sexually repressive American freedom. And so, how much that might have, I'm just sort of curious about your thoughts on that, which I know you have.
So thank you for the question, Tina. Even though I wrote a paper about speculation, I feel that I will resist speculating too much about what would have been. What's interesting to me is, though, exactly what you just said, which is that there was this opening that he knew and that he carried and that he longed for. I think, going back to Ofer, kind of along the same lines that Ofer was saying about the Midwest, I think under the circumstances, I think of his position in the Midwest as one of relative safety under the circumstances, because it put him outside of his family orbit, and he passed. So, the first thing that I noticed about the memoir was the longing for Weimar. It was only when I went into the archive that I understood more about what that longing was about. So I absolutely do agree, and would want to emphasize that part of what he's telling us in the subjunctive there is that it could have been different for him in ways that exceed the way that he's normally conceptualized as a Jewish thinker. Yeah.
Thanks for your question, Atina. I think if the history of the Mosse family really highlights or underscores the ambiguities of emancipation, right? I think, if you think about the Mosse family in Berlin and its spectacular rise in the 1850s and 60s, what you have to keep in mind is the particular nature of emancipation in Prussia. The 1812 decree gave Jews economic and residential freedom, right? And that made possible the economic and social mobility of Jews in Prussia, right? That said, let's remember that the 1812 edict only applied to the old Prussian provinces. It didn't apply to the territories that Prussia acquired after 1815. So that in the period after 1815, there were at least 21 different laws that applied to Jews in the various territories. Some historians would argue that there were 30 different laws, right? So that in itself shows you the ambiguities and tensions. But what was also characteristic of that 1812 emancipation law is that it came in the wake of the emancipation of serfs in Prussia. It came in the wake of the imposition of municipal self-government in Prussia, so that it was tied to the dismantling of many corporate institutions, but also began a process of political liberalization or whatever, or the inclusion of certainly of the middle classes in municipal politics. And what went hand in hand with the economic mobility of Jews in Prussia was their participation in municipal politics. I mean, this is actually something that's largely overlooked. But already beginning in the Vormärz, in the 20s and 30s, you have the emergence of a particular Jewish communal type of Jews who begin their careers as activists within the Jewish community, running welfare organizations and other kinds of organizations, and who then become involved in municipal politics and are elected and appointed to positions of influence and importance. And it's true in some, well, anyway, I don't want to go into the details. So the spectacular rise of the Mosse family was directly linked to that 1812 Emancipation Edict. But if you look at other states, Jews didn't have that kind of economic and residential freedom. So, you know, particularly because of the tessellation of the German states in the continuing tessellation of the German states in the 19th century, you have very specific developments in each of the states, and you can't understand what happens to Jews in Germany. You can't say anything in general. You actually have to be very specific about the situation in each state and what the consequences were.
Okay, there are more questions, but we will have to close the session now. I would like to thank again to our speakers.